Black Labor, White Wealth by Dr. Claude Anderson. Psychological and social conditioning process. Okay, do that. Psychological and social conditioning process. The National Public Policy on Blacks was structured to incorporate the psychological and social conditioning process for blacks and whites that evolved over the course of American history. The National Public Policy on Blacks was structured to incorporate the psychological and social conditioning process for blacks and whites that evolved over the course of American history. Slaveholders' absolute power over blacks allowed them to operate an efficient and effective slavery conditioning system. Slaveholders constructed internal controls on slaves that minimized the external force necessary to control them. The government provided the environment for the legal framework that allowed the conditioning process to exist and to operate for 250 years. For 250 years. The slaveholders conditioned blacks to serve as good slaves. The effects carried over into the freed black society and affected the general behavior of blacks as a race of people. Table 10 indicates some of the major goals, techniques, and strategies employed in the conditioning process that forged a helpless, submissive, and manageable labor force. Taught to be disciplined, or be taught discipline. Endless, hard, tedious, dirty labor, be inferior to whites, never seen any blacks with power, know their place, the color line in Jim Crow, be backward, childlike, planned ignorance and humiliation, be fearful of master, physical and psychological deprivation, place master above self, denial of humanity and hope, surrender totally, religious humility and hopelessness, see whites as superiors, masters reward and punishment system, be totally dependent, impoverishment, marginal existence, be racially divided, destruction of family and racial unity. Okay. The process was designed to instill in blacks strict discipline, a sense of inferiority, belief in the slave owner's superior power, acceptance of owner's standards, and a deep sense of a slave's helplessness and dependence. The slave owners strove to cut blacks off from their own history, culture, language, and community, and to inculcate white society's value system. That blacks are still burdened by the legacies of such conditioning speaks to its effectiveness. Though some slaves resisted, the system worked because the majority of slaves gave passive approval and cooperation to the slaveholder. That in turn made slavery more profitable and permanent. Had slaves been determined not to cooperate and to sabotage production, regardless of the cost to themselves and their families, they undoubtedly would have changed the course of history and perhaps spared their descendants centuries of suffering. Meritorious manumission. Meritorious manumission was the legal act of freeing a slave for good deeds as defined by the national public policy. Meritorious manumission could be granted to a slave who distinguished himself by saving the life of the white master, inventing a new medicine, or snitching on fellow slaves. This was a destructive weapon in the slaveholders' arsenal and a powerful component of the public policy. The importance that whites placed on black informants is emphatically demonstrated by a rare moment that the by a rare monument that the town of Harper's Ferry erected to honor Hayward Shepherd, a black man who was killed by the totally committed abolitionist John Brown and his raiding party shortly before the beginning of the Civil War. Hayward Shepherd was shot dead by John Brown's party when he recognized John Brown and attempted to warn the town that they were there to free the slaves. In grateful recognition for placing the economic interests of the slaveholders above the freedom of his own people, the town erected the only monument honoring a black man who could appropriately be described as a Sambo. Since the black since the black rights since the black civil rights movement of the late 1960s, the statue has been stored beside the city's major museum and covered with a wooden box. Meritorious manumission was not only used as an instrument to reward blacks, but it was a device for destroying black unity and race loyalty. It created a very effective informant system. The meritorious manumission policy introduced a strong element of distrust among the slaves and made it more difficult for slaves to organize a revolt. The psychological techniques used were designed to drive wedges between slaves and to train them to trust no one other than the white slave masters. Meritorious manumission was first instituted in Virginia in 1710. According to Peter M. Bergman's The Chronological History of the Negro in America, the technique of meritorious manumission was adopted by all of the colonies. The first in Virginia of the legislative power to break the bonds of a slave was made in this year, 1710. A Negro named Will was cited for discouraging a slave conspiracy in the colony, and in recognition and reward of the public service, an act was passed conferring freedom upon him. This act of freedom read, "This said Negro, Will, is and shall be forever hereafter free from slavery, and shall enjoy and have all the liberties, privileges, and immunities of or to a free Negro belonging." The Act of Freedom restored some of the liberties, privileges, and immunities that Maryland's public edict took from blacks in 1638. This national discipline policy was so successful that in more than 250 years of slavery, there was not one successful slave revolt in North America. Of the mere 150 to 200 attempted slave insurrections, in nearly every instance, the slave revolts were prematurely exposed. Unfortunately, the informant in nearly every instance was a black person, keeping blacks in a minority status. White society has always placed a great deal of importance in maintaining power and control through numerical dominance. Since the public policy stressed keeping blacks in a controlled subordinate state, The national immigration laws, beginning with the first one in 1790, were used to were used as control tools. Immigration policies and laws kept the black population below the white comfort level, usually less than 8%. During the 20 years preceding the Revolutionary War, the colonial settlers were extremely fearful of the uncontrolled number of black slaves being shipped into the country. By 1750, the percentage of the total national population that was black had reached nearly a third. Black slave revolts were on the increase, and British military officers encouraged slaves to rise up against the slave owners. Ironically, none did, though they had good opportunities during the Revolutionary War. In 1790, white society's fear of reprisals from blacks prompted the first Congress to enact a law that mandated taking a population census and publishing the results every 10 years. Census data monitored social, economic, and political changes according to race and provided the government with a database for designing public policies. Table 11 outlines the legal means that were used by whites during the past 200 years to skillfully manipulate social circumstances to maintain the population status quo between them and blacks. The increase in the black population in the 1700s was counteracted by the enactment of the first immigration law in 1790, which sought European whites to reduce the total black population to a range that made whites comfortable between 5 and 8%. Federal and Table 11, federal and state actions to keep blacks a numerical minority. Total population, action taken that reduced percentage of black population. Year 1720, percent of the U.S. population, 15.20%. Virginia, limited increases in blacks. 1730, 14%. Virginia put 5% duty on imported slaves. 1740, 19%. Georgians opposed slavery increase. 1750, 33%. Virginia put 20% duty on imported slaves. 1760, 33%. All colonies petitioned to ban slaves. 1770, 33%. Continental Congress banned slaves. 1780, 32%. Revolutionary War halted slave trade. 1790, 19.3%. First white-only naturalization law. 1800, 19%. The North passed anti-slavery laws. 1810, 18.5%. International slave trading outlawed. 1840, 16%. Influx of white European immigrants. 1860, 14.10%, 14.1%. influx immigrants, Asian, European, 1890, 11.9% influx of immigrants, Southern European, 1910, influx immigrants, Jewish, 11%, 11% black population, influx Jewish. 1930, 9.7%, 9.7% black population, quota for black immigrants, 0. Sources: the Immigration Acts of 1790, 1982, 1892, 1907, 1924, and 1936. The chronological history of the Negro in America by Peter Bergman and the World Encyclopedia. Mm-hmm. Okay, though blacks had a birth rate that doubled that of whites, U.S. immigration laws annually brought in so many non-black immigrants that the nation's black population was reduced from 33% in the late 1700s to less than 10% at the beginning of the 1900s. Strict anti-black immigration laws assured the majority white society that blacks would remain a numerical as well as a psychological minority. Though immigration policies at the turn of the 20th century contained language that could have set a black immigration quota to 1% of 1%, for all practical purposes, until the late 1960s, immigration was closed to blacks. As indicated in Table 11, whites consistently used a variety of measures to keep the black population below 8%. Immigration policies were the major device for keeping both the black percentages under control, especially after the successful Haitian Revolt. Following 1790, immigration policies and the massive influx of illegal non-black immigrants drove the black population into the low teens. There never has been and never will be a black refugee program, no matter how desperate or life-threatening the circumstances are that they are fleeing. There never has been, and never will be, a black refugee program, no matter how desperate or life-threatening the circumstances are that they are fleeing. The nation's total black population has climbed to 12.4%, which is above whites' 8% comfort range and dangerously close to their take action 15% tipping point. If history is any indicator, the majority society will initiate measures to reduce or increase their control over America's black population at their whim. Ironically, Black Africa constitutes 12.4% of the world's population. In order to develop a plan for self empowerment, complete with goals and policies, blacks must understand the public policy model and doctrines that were used against them in order to empower white society. The model used by white America are very successful. Just as whites have done, blacks must now unashamedly protect their self interest, pursue real power and wealth, and shape themselves into a politically and economically competitive group in America. The greatest challenge to black America is to do what blacks have never been permitted to do in the past. Through centuries of slave insurrections, civil rights demonstrations, and urban riots, blacks have never had a public policy or clearly identifiable goal. They have not developed a public policy. They have not developed a public policy on how they are going to deal with racism, where they intend to go as a people, and how best to get there. The public policy ought to be broadly disseminated to all blacks and interlinked with all levels of black communities across America. All segments, churches, schools, businesses, and community organizations should be involved in designing strategies and supporting the public policy. Rather than in reinventing the wheel, blacks should use white society's models for establishing public policy because it was very successful. Timeline 1954 to 1992. 1954, Black Civil Rights Movement began. White flights to suburbs began. 1954 to 1962. 1965, civil rights laws enacted. Black Power movement began. 1966, urban riots. 1966, 1969. White flight to Sunbelt continued. Okay, 1969. White conservative movement emerged. Okay, sexism replaced racism. 1970, 1992, Second Reconstruction. Conclusion. Black Americans have always been a compassionate and caring people. They should continue to do so. But it is now time for them to put their own interests first. If they are to have any chance of changing their negative living conditions, Black America must develop strategies and programs that serve their best interest and allow them to both develop and protect themselves within a society that historically committed harmful acts against them. Until black obsolescence was reached about 20 years ago, blacks had limited ability to organize because they lacked capital, leadership, and resources, and they were restrained by an economic system that still had a use for them. Now that black labor is non-essential and expendable, blacks as a group are vulnerable and expendable. A national plan for black empowerment should focus on blacks becoming politically and economically competitive by acquiring increased wealth and resource power. The greatest challenge to black America is to do what it has never done before. Through Through the centuries of slavery, Jim Crowism, the Civil Rights Movement, and the Black Power period, blacks have never had a public policy or racial goals to effectively deal with racism. Instead of an empowerment plan, new generations of blacks have inherited the vestiges of a failed 1960s strategy. Three major failings deserve highlighting. First, black leadership mistakenly believed that by removing Jim Crow symbols, that racism would effectively die. Second, they thought integration would make them equal and give them control of resources and power. Third, they failed to construct long-term institutions with long-term goals that could transcend generational lines and produce a never-ending flow of competent, well-informed new talent. Young blacks must have a public policy and a plan for direction. All segments of the community, churches, schools, businesses, and community organizations, must be involved in formulating and implementing the plan. But the plan must be coordinated nationally by an institute with an intellectual infrastructure. Modeling the methods used by whites, blacks must develop an accountable system to make sure that all blacks support the goals of the plan. Blacks blacks will have blacks will have to be equally as determined and committed to public policy on black self-empowerment as white society has been to public policy on the use of blacks. Blacks must be willing to apply social sanctions and other penalties against those who violate the public policy for blacks. The Black Empowerment Plan must be based upon a vision of vigorously competing in a changing world. The Black Empowerment Plan must be based upon a vision of vigorously competing in a changing world. The plan must go beyond the dream of equality and integration, which hangs before them like a carrot on a stick.